Youth sports is meant to help kids grow as people. It's supposed to be a place where they can begin learning about themselves, make mistakes in a safer way, and even develop some life skills that they may be able to use outside of sports. After over a decade of working in different levels of youth sports, what I've noticed is there's a huge part that's quietly disappearing. In this video, I'm going to show you what's disappearing, why it matters more than most people realize, and what we can do to make sure it doesn't keep disappearing any further than it already has. It's no surprise in different sports or age groups that as the competition increases, that everything gets more intense. There's more pressure, there's more focus on outcomes, and there's just usually more professionalism as well. Although there's a bigger discussion that I could go on about with the professionalism of sports, what I'm more concerned with is as the competition level and the performance demands and expectations increase for children, the level of support that they're receiving isn't keeping up to pace. Development and performance aren't always necessarily the same thing, especially with kids. And from what I've seen, that gap usually shows up in 4 different ways. The first has to do with the narrowing that kids are experiencing in regards to their identity. For a lot of kids in competitive sports, it stops becoming something they do and it becomes who they are. With the professionalization of sports, it seems like a lot of more people are talking to these kids as athletes, not as people. So when things go well, everything's great for them. But when they struggle in sports, which they eventually are going to at some stage, everything crumbles. This isn't me saying they can't be an athlete. All I'm saying is that from what we say to them and what we communicate to kids, if we're speaking to them as athletes first, is that they start to narrow the way they view themselves. And that's probably one of the last things we could do to really expand how a kid really develops. The second thing I notice is that coaches' problem solving often gets really narrowed. Rather than asking or getting curious about what else might be influencing a kid in regards to their behavior or their performance, it often gets labeled with a lack of effort, a lack of execution on the skill, or just too much responsibility given to them when they're not ready for it. A player who might be overwhelmed or slower might get labeled as lazy. A kid who's often unsure might get labeled as not confident enough. These labels could seem fitting, but at the end of the day, we really don't know 100% of what's going on. Another common thing is that a lot of programs and coaches will talk about developing kids on and off the court or on and off the field. But in practice, there's very little in place to support that consistently. Now, most people generally care about helping kids in this way. So this isn't about bad intentions from coaches or programs. Most, especially, are just volunteers that are doing the best they can. This is more to do with the lack of systems and consistency that these programs or coaches have when saying that they want to develop kids all around, but they actually don't. Coaches and programs will often stick to performance because that's what they know. Because without development, it becomes a nice to have in these programs, and it might just become luck that kids develop as people. And the last one is a big one, but that kids just become less of themselves. What this may look like is the curious kid that stops asking questions, the creative kid that plays it safe, or even just the expressive kid that keeps it quiet. They can still perform and do what's needed, but how they're doing it is by narrowing themselves to fit into what they feel is acceptable. This can work for a while, but it's hard to sustain, especially for kids. Because when human development isn't supported, kids will adapt to survive, especially so they can just stay on the team as well. None of these things that I've mentioned means sports is going to fail every kid. Everyone responds differently to different environments, people and places and all that sort of stuff. But fortunately, there's stuff we can do about this. And you don't need to be a coach. You don't need to have everything figured out. Small shifts in the way we interact with kids can have a real difference down the line. The first shift is widening how we problem solve. When a kid is struggling, instead of jumping to judgment, we can get curious. What else might be influencing them right now? Because performance issues are often signals, they're not the whole story. Another simple but powerful shift for kids is to remind them that they are more than what they do, not just for themselves, but also for others. They're not just athletes, and they're also not just students. They're not just friends, and they're also not just a daughter or son. Consider these as planting seeds of curiosity for children learning more about themselves, that they don't have to have everything figured out, but if they're assuming all they are those things, that they can get curious about that for themselves. Another big one is just being able to find and provide more spaces for kids to show up as themselves. When kids are able to bring more parts of themselves to their learning environments, they spend less of their energy on just trying to hold it all together, and they can spend that energy instead on actually learning. Practically, in group settings, this will look like holding space for different types of baseline personalities and even just people's different quirks to be accepted. And I'm not just talking about kids as well, but also the adults, whether there's coaches, whether they're parents, whoever it is, that it's a safe space for everyone that is there. Because when kids are seeing adults in their life that they value, especially their mums and dads, being able to bring multiple different parts of themselves to environments, they will also sense a bit of safety just from that alone. The final shift is embedding development into everyday language. And you don't need to be a coach to do this either. How we talk to kids and how we talk around them shapes how they view challenges, for example. Because there's a big difference between kids saying, I'm not good at this, compared to, I'm still working on this. If there's one way to think about all this, it's like a seesaw. On one side, you have performance, and on the other side, you have development. The performance is everything you'd naturally think of around how intense someone is training or playing, how well are they executing on what they need to do, and what outcomes are they getting. On the development side, we balance this out by us seeing how regulated a kid can be, along with how they make decisions on what they're executing on, along with what they're learning as well. So it's not always about getting the outcomes specifically, but what are they learning so they can get closer to achieving those outcomes again in the future. When kids are younger, this seesaw needs to be way more balanced consistently. Not that we don't care about performance, but by improving our capacity on this side of things, it allows kids to have more performance down the track. Because the last thing we want to have happen is that we put too much weight on the performance sides of things, and it's not that kids would fall off instantly, but it's not a matter of if they fall off, but when. And we don't want kids falling off, especially when it comes to sports. So the goal isn't to remove the pressure from all these things, but it's to lower the standards for performance relative to kids' capacities and abilities. And when we start shifting the focus towards development, it becomes not just now kids are performing sometimes, but that they have the capacity to show up consistently when they do need to perform, because they're coming from a regulated place, they're making decisions from a place, they know why they're making the decisions, and they're learning from those decisions as well. When development is supported consistently through us questioning the way we problem solve, through the way we speak around kids, and also from the way we hold space for them as part of this all, sports becomes the place that it was always meant to be for kids. A place where kids don't just learn how to compete, but also learn about themselves and facing challenges along the way. And if this resonated, the most powerful thing you can do is to not change everything at once. As a matter of fact, you don't have to change anything just because I've said that these are things that I've obviously seen from my experience and the people that I've worked with. Instead, take one small thing and see how you can apply it differently in your week for you or the child you're around that can make it a bit less performance focused and more focused on their development as a person. Speak to you soon.